Day 293 of the Ukrainian war map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzy here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine today. And as always, I'll start off with having a look at those Russian military losses, so as of the 13th of December there, just as we take a look at the exhaustion of the Russian forces here. And in the last 24-hour reporting period, there's been an additional 500 Russian military personnel losses. So currently sitting at 95,260 there. Then in terms of Russian hardware losses, so we'll take a look at the armoured combat vehicles firstly. So two losses there for the Russian army, then artillery, 2 losses there as well. So that's really all on the hardware side of things today. Then we'll jump back to the map, and as we sometimes do, we'll start out in the Russian motherland as well. So this time in the Russian Oblast of Bryansk, in fact in Klinsky right here. So about 12 hours ago, Russian channels reported on the arrival of artillery at a military unit in Klinsky right here, not too far from the Ukrainian border. In fact, if I pull up the ruler, we'll see about 50 kilometers or about 30 miles. But then, more recently in terms of news, about, say, 10 hours ago, so a little bit more closer to now, in the very same location of the military unit, it was reported that there were some explosions here. Just as if there was an early morning NATO satellite, was just waiting for the right moment to feed the coordinates back to Ukraine for high precision HIMARS strikes, for instance, there. Then moving along on the map, we'll, just for a moment, we'll take a look at Belarus. This one's more of a news piece, but there were reports that Russia transferred about 12 T-72 tanks to Belarus in the last day, potentially for use with a Belarusian-based offensive into Ukraine. Now, I'm actually reminded of Belarus effectively being forced to send about 90 tanks to Russia a couple of months ago, maybe about September time there. So if I was Belarus, I'd probably feel pretty shortchanged right now. Then we'll move across back onto Ukrainian land, so in the Donbass, in fact the north of the Donbass today, where there was some footage received by sent from the Kraken, which confirmed the armed forces of Ukraine control Kislivka. So I'll just zoom in and we'll get Kislivka right there on the screen. But also Ukraine now controls the adjacent town of Kotlia Rivka, which is right next door. And in fact, if you pull up the date map, you'll find just in the previous day, it was in the grey zone. And perhaps you've heard of the Kraken before in this war context. So they are the Ukrainian Kraken Regiment, which is largely a volunteer unit that's quite adept with military prowess. And as the name would suggest, their logo is no different to that of the Kraken, the mythical creature or mythical beast. Then further down on the current landscape, so we are still looking in the Donbass, north-ish region there, where for the highly contested settlement of Crimea, it seems to be that the Ukrainian forces are gradually closing in on it from most sides, except of course from the east. Now this map doesn't yet show us this, but it does mean that Russia only has one way to go here at the moment, as Ukraine, or the Ukrainian army, loves to encircle the Russian army and take them out through means of fire control, artillery fire from all sides basically. So Russian forces are having a hard day of it here today. Then we'll move across down to Bakhmut. So Bakhmut still holds, and the Wagner PMC continues to recruit thousands of Russian prisoners to fight in Ukraine, particularly in this region right here. So their actions on the battlefield are ineffective, yet their numbers are great. Oh, and I should also mention that the Wagner PMC is a private militia group of the Russian army, military contractors, if you will, which is actually outlawed for use in Russia. But the Kremlin doesn't follow any of its own rules, agreements, laws, memorandums, etc., etc. Though it might be a little bit more specific, or better to say that as long as the use of them doesn't oppose Putin's power, they can be used in Russia. Then we'll move down on the map to where, so the Russian army took quite the beating right here, so at Velika Novosinka. As in the last day, the Russian army did in fact try to make a push here, albeit unsuccessfully, and they were repelled. So the Russian army themselves actually, well, sources from in the Russian army confirmed that they did in fact retreat, the Russian forces here, and the Ukrainian general staff reported a lot of Russian equipment was destroyed. So to be honest, I am heavily reminded of what's happened just next door here for Russia in the past few weeks. So we're talking about Pavlivka, Volodar, and Mariinka, where Russia's earlier attempts to take ground here were just met with complete and utter annihilation, and vastly done so from the methodical and pinpoint artillery fire control from the Ukrainian forces. Actually, there was a Russian Telegram channel where they spoke of the occurrence today, saying, quote, "We returned to our original position, everything was planned as an offensive, but in fact it took place as a reconnaissance in force. We learned lots of useful things." So I believe they learned a lot of useful things, like how to lose a lot of personnel and heavy equipment. So I really bet they did. And this I find to be one of Russia's main problems with their war effort, their invasion into Ukraine. It's this constant echo chamber that the Russian forces have themselves in, communicating some sort of everything's going to plan sentiment. So it's just that pure and simple denial that has the habit of getting them caught up in the same military failures over and over. Then we'll move across on the map to the Zaporizhia Oblast today. So we'll just zoom into Melitopol. Here we go. So the main highway bridge on the M14, I'll have to zoom right in for this one, was taken out near the occupied city of Melitopol. So here it is. There we go. Quite sure it's the southern one. And so far we only have basic photos of what it looks like, with the span of the middle sinking down as seen from the top, which is obviously pretty tough for Russia. For the Russian army, or the Russian war machine for that matter, is being particularly reliant upon roads, rail, and in this case, main highway bridges for supply and logistics purposes. So a target like this would have been an obvious choice for the armed forces of Ukraine. Having said that, I suspect this one was actually from a homegrown Ukrainian partisan or saboteur attack. For instance, something like a homemade device rigged to blow beneath the bridge itself, just based on what I can physically see in the photo so far. Then we'll move across on the map to the other front line of Kherson, so the Kherson Oblast, if I can zoom out enough there, where the Russian forces continue to shell indiscriminately in and around the recently liberated Kherson city. So shelling it from the south side, just below the Dnipro River, from Holopristan and Oleshki. And this indiscriminate shelling is some pretty ugly Russian military methodology, to be honest. But those southern Russian locations from where Russia is actually firing its artillery shells are continued to be fired back at with pinpoint precision by Ukrainian counter-battery strikes. In fact, keep an eye on these oinky pigs for a moment here. So I'm just going to go back in time because we'll see something interesting that's happened over the last 2 weeks in terms of the build-up or accumulation of Russian forces. I just need to go back far enough. It shouldn't take too long here at all. And here we go. Okay, great. So I'm going to zoom out a bit. And what you can see here is what would in fact be the previous concentration of Russian forces as indicated by the oinky pigs on the map right here. And of course, when we move back forward in time, you can see pretty quickly they've been forced to retreat and disperse into the southern direction, and many of which are now in the forest. And moving on, but it might be good to mention here in this location, so the recently liberated Kherson North Bank, which is all indicated by the green here, has now had electricity restored for almost 90% of consumers in the North Bank there. Because, of course, you may remember when Russia was forced to retreat from this location about 30 days ago, they left the parting gift of completely destroying the energy system here on the north. Biggest dick move ever. But it obviously is really fulfilling to see how quickly the Ukrainians could actually restore that energy system there. Then we'll move across to some news for the day. So in his evening address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia is preparing a new wave of missile strikes to further damage Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Now, you might remember these large missile strike waves commenced on October 10th when Russia noticed it wasn't winning the battle on the battlefield, so opted to strike Ukraine's energy infrastructure and grid in the hopes that Ukrainians would throw out Zelensky or no longer stand behind him. But Ukrainians instead only became more determined in the face of these strikes. But to put all of that in context, I've had to create a graph to show you all 6 large waves of Russian missile strikes so far because it didn't exist online yet in this form for me to extract. So here's what I've created here. Now, this graph does have its limitations. For instance, it doesn't yet show the Ukrainian missile interception rate. For instance, the first wave, the Ukrainian army only took out about 50% of the missiles headed their way by Russia. So we're talking about Ukrainian air defenses working to a tune of about 50%. But by the time the most recent wave hit, so wave 6, as you can see there on the 5th of December, the interception rate climbed all the way up to about 85%. But also, what I think this graph also really shows you as well is Russia's relative inability to up the ante of its strike volume sufficiently enough in the midst of Ukrainian upping its own interception rates of said missiles. You see, Russia is aware that it needs to fire a larger salvo of missiles now in an attempt to overwhelm Ukraine's air defense systems, which due to NATO existence has expanded quite a bit in just the last 2 months alone. So we're talking a strike capacity for Russia to at least be about 110 missiles across Ukraine to effectively strike at Ukraine's power grid. Only problem is, Russia's been depleting its own high-end missile stocks. Not to mention its production rates are also slow because of all those sanctions on Western supplied parts. But also Russia's logistics and readiness rates are actually pretty shocking. We never expected this before the war. Oh, and maybe most importantly now, Ukraine now has the operational capability to strike about 400 miles or about 650 kilometers deep into the Russian motherland air bases, which would normally assist in performing the airstrikes, for instance. And of course, this is a new Ukrainian strategic capability, which we've only seen in the past week alone, for the most part. So the balance of power really continues to seem to change. And my favorite Zelensky quote, so as Zelensky says, once Russia's ability to strike Ukraine is neutralized, it will have no option but to negotiate for peace. And I still believe that, and certainly put it on a t-shirt one day, even though it's not that catchy. Then in some other news, one of Ukraine's embassies received another bloody package, so one of animal organs, in Russia's latest off the battlefield act of intimidation towards Ukraine. This time it was at the Ukrainian embassy located in Greece. So all this comes off the back of other recent Ukrainian embassies that have received such intimidation packages. But I really am confused by the Russian logic or the mindset here that actually thinks that this could work, as the rest of the world just sees Russia as even more savage. So quite the backfire, really. Then in some other news, Poland and Germany will start work on the deployment of the German Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems on the border with Ukraine in the coming days. And this was just announced by the Polish president. And this is yet another Russian backfire situation. So Russia fired too close to Poland's border back about a month ago. Now Poland is placing quite a high-end American-made air defense system even closer to Russia's borders now. Now you might be asking, well, why not in Ukraine, Jozzy? Well, it requires specialist training and initially requires about 90 US servicemen to operate, which would appear as too large of a Western provocation to allow about 100 US troops in Ukraine right now, right next door to Russia. But hey, maybe one day. And then in another Russian military mobilization blunder, so no image or video for this one, my apologies, it's going to have to be a bit of a stock image or something, but in the Russian-occupied Donetsk Oblast, so police officers in the region have reportedly started calling for women to be mobilized now for the Russian war efforts in Ukraine. Now, all of this is in an attempt to replenish manpower losses for the devastating losses Russia has been taking on the front lines of the wider Donbass recently. And apparently, this suggested approach is being seriously taken and might already be starting in some form too. But more importantly, the fact that your army's manpower is so low that you have to start considering female conscription on a level like this just makes me want to say to Russia, just give up already. Oh, and I also found it odd that the Donetsk Oblast police officers were making the recommendations. I guess they probably think they're next in line for being cannon fodder and then started to grasp at straws with other suggestions. Then in a bit of a funny video to round it all off with today, guys, so Russia has been sending more old and unmaintained Soviet-era equipment from its far eastern Siberian location, oblasts in that area, to assist with its invasion efforts. Now, this footage shows an old 1960s Soviet-era BMP-1, so that's an infantry fighting vehicle on tracks, but equipment isn't the only thing it appears that Russia is low on. They're clearly low on military logistics experience as well, causing not one, but two IFVs to have to be discarded on the side of the road in the snowy patches there, due to being not adequately fastened to the railway wagon in the first place. So just give it 24 hours and those two machines will be absolutely covered in snow until the seeding of winter in Siberia in about May 2023. And unfortunately, this is two less hardware opportunities for Ukraine to capture as well. So, such a shame. So, thanks for watching, guys. Please leave a comment, subscribe, feel free to share the video, and yeah, thanks again for all of your support, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers.